I still remember the exact weight of that Bible. It was burgundy, with my name embossed in gold letters on the lower right corner, Marcus Elijah Tate, a gift from my grandmother on the morning of my baptism. I was 9 years old, standing at the edge of that baptismal pool in my white robe, and my father was watching from the pulpit with tears running down his face. Not sad tears. The kind of tears a man cries when he believes God is doing something holy right in front of him. My father was Pastor Raymond Tate of New Covenant Baptist Church in Milledgeville, Georgia, and I was his only son. I need you to understand what that meant before I tell you the rest of this story, because if you don't understand what it meant to be Pastor Raymond Tate's son in that town, in that church, in that specific world, then nothing that happened later will make any sense to you. Being his son wasn't just a family role, it was a calling, a position. A promise I was expected to fulfill for a community of 312 people who had watched me grow up from the front pew, who had fed me sweet potato pie at every church anniversary dinner, who had prayed over my report cards and my football injuries, and my college applications like my life was partially theirs. Because in Milledgeville, Georgia, at New Covenant Baptist Church, it was. I grew up loved. I need to say that clearly because so many stories like mine begin with cruelty, and mine didn't. My childhood was full of warmth. My mother sang in the choir every Sunday with a voice that made old women cry. My grandmother made pound cake that people still talk about. My father was stern but gentle, the kind of man who could silence a room just by walking into it, but who also sat with dying church members and held their hands in the dark. I was surrounded by community, by faith, by belonging. And I was secretly, desperately, completely in love with my best friend, Devonte Williams. Devonte joined our church when we were both 11. His family had moved from Savannah after his parents divorced, and his mother brought him and his 2 sisters to New Covenant looking for community. He was quiet at first, serious. He had these dark brown eyes that seemed to be always thinking something that he wasn't saying out loud. He played piano the way some people breathe, like it wasn't a skill he had learned, but something his body already knew. My father put him in the youth choir within 3 months, and after that, Devonte and I were inseparable. We spent every Saturday at each other's houses. We stayed up until 2 in the morning debating whether Kobe or LeBron was better, whether God really cared about football games, whether we were going to leave Georgia when we grew up or stay. We shared everything, the way boys do when they're young enough that closeness doesn't feel like a threat yet. I didn't have a name for what I felt then. I just knew that when Devonte laughed at something I said, something in my chest opened up. I knew that when he sat beside me on the piano bench and showed me how to play a chord, I didn't want him to move. I knew that I thought about him in a way that I didn't think about anyone else, and that thinking about him in that way filled me with something I already, even at 12, even at 13, recognized as dangerous. By the time we were 16, I had a name for it. I just refused to say it out loud. The thing about growing up in a church like New Covenant is that you absorb theology the way you absorb language. It goes in before you're old enough to examine it. I had heard sermons about sin and abomination since before I could read. I had watched my father shake his head at the news when they talked about gay rights legislation, watched him speak from the pulpit about the family being under attack. It wasn't hateful in the way that comes from ugliness. It was sincere. My father genuinely believed what he preached, and I had been breathing in that belief my entire life, so by the time I understood what I was feeling, I had already also absorbed the verdict on it. I was 16 and I was the pastor's son, and I was in love with my best friend, and I believed, in the deepest part of myself, that I was broken. I did what you do when you believe something is broken inside you. I prayed. I prayed every single night with the kind of desperation that is almost physical, on my knees beside my bed, forehead nearly touching the mattress, asking God to fix me, change me, take this thing away from me. I bargained. I made promises. I told God that I would preach, that I would serve, that I would give my whole life to the church if He would just make me normal. I believed for years that if I prayed hard enough and served faithfully enough, the feeling would eventually dissolve. It never did. Devonte and I graduated high school the same spring. We had both gotten into college, me to Morehouse on a partial scholarship, him to Georgia State for music. The summer before we left was the last summer everything felt intact. We spent it the way we'd spent every summer since we were 11, mostly together, mostly talking about everything and nothing. There was one evening in late July, when we were sitting on the hood of his car in the parking lot of a Dairy Queen outside of town, watching the sun go down over a field of red Georgia clay, and he said something that I have never forgotten. He said, "You ever feel like you're waiting to start your real life?" And I looked at him and I said, "Every single day." Neither of us said anything else after that, but something passed between us in that silence. I felt it. I don't know even now what he felt. We never talked about it. 2 weeks later, we drove to our separate colleges and the summer ended, and we both stepped into the lives we were supposed to be building. Morehouse changed me in ways I didn't expect and couldn't have predicted. I had grown up in Milledgeville, which is not a small town by Georgia standards, but it has a particular insularity that you don't notice until you leave. At Morehouse, I was surrounded by black men from everywhere: Atlanta, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, London, men who carried themselves differently, who had different relationships with faith and family and identity, who talked about things openly that I had never heard spoken out loud. I met gay men who were not hiding, not apologizing, not praying for deliverance. Men who were brilliant and whole and comfortable in their skin in a way that confused and fascinated and terrified me. I didn't come out at Morehouse. I want to be honest about that. I kept my head down, kept my grades up, called home every Sunday after church, and maintained the version of Marcus Tate that everyone expected. But something was shifting underneath. The architecture of my belief system was changing quietly in ways I couldn't stop. Every conversation I had, every book I read, every friendship I made was slowly rearranging the interior of who I was. I graduated at 22 and went straight to seminary because that was the plan. My father's plan, the church's plan, my plan, or rather, the plan I had been handed and had accepted without ever asking whether I'd chosen it. I was going to get my theology degree, come back to Milledgeville, eventually take over New Covenant. That was the story. I was still trying to live inside it. Seminary was harder. The theology was more rigorous, the scrutiny more intense, and I was spending every day studying the exact texts that had been used to condemn me my entire life. I read everything, every scholarly argument, every historical context, every interpretation and counter-interpretation. I wrestled with Scripture the way Jacob wrestled with the angel, desperate and exhausted, and refusing to let go until it gave me something I could live with. And somewhere in the middle of my second year of seminary, in a small apartment in Atlanta at 2 a.m, I stopped praying for God to change me. Not because I stopped believing in God, but because I finally, after years of reading and studying and honest intellectual reckoning, stopped believing that what I was feeling was something God needed to fix. I was 24 years old when I came home for Christmas. Devonte was there. He had moved back to Milledgeville after graduating from Georgia State, was teaching piano lessons and playing organ at New Covenant, had become essential to the church in the way his gifts always made him essential. We fell back into our friendship the way you fall into a river, suddenly and completely, the current already knowing you. We spent 3 days together over that holiday, mostly at his mother's house, mostly talking until late, catching each other up on the years that had been building separately while we weren't watching. On the last night before I drove back to Atlanta, we were sitting in his living room, the Christmas tree lights still on, the house quiet, and he said something that split me open. He said, "Marcus, I need to tell you something. I've been wanting to tell you for a long time." He looked at his hands. "I'm gay." The room was very still. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. "I know," I said. And then, because it was late and I was tired of carrying it, and because it was Devonte, the person I had trusted with more of myself than anyone on earth, I said, "I am too." We sat with that for a long time. Neither of us cried. Neither of us laughed. We just sat in the light of the Christmas tree in his quiet house in Milledgeville, Georgia, and let the truth exist in the room between us. It was the most relief I had ever felt in my life. Not joy exactly. Relief. The specific physical sensation of putting down something very heavy that you have been carrying for so long you forgot it had weight. We did not get together that night or in the weeks that followed. That's not what this story is about. What passed between us was more important than romance. It was recognition. Two people who had grown up in the same house of faith, carrying the same secret, finally seeing each other clearly. We talked for hours that night about what it had been like, about the praying, the hiding, the quiet desperation, about what came next. What came next was the question I couldn't stop turning over. I was still in seminary. I was still, technically, on a path to ministry. I had not told my parents. I had not told anyone at the church. And now Devonte and I were both sitting in the same impossible position, gay men who had been raised as pillars of a community that did not have room for who we actually were. Devonte told his mother in February. I was on the phone with him when he did it. I sat in my apartment in Atlanta and listened to the muffled sound of the conversation through his phone and then the silence after. He called me back an hour later and said his mother had cried, said she loved him, said she needed time. He sounded hollowed out but also quietly lighter. I didn't tell my parents in February or March or April. I told them in June, on a Sunday evening, after I had driven the 2 hours from Atlanta and eaten dinner at our family table, and sat through the particular agony of an ordinary evening knowing what was coming. My mother was washing dishes. My father was in his study. I asked them both to sit down at the kitchen table. My father knew before I finished my first sentence. I saw it move across his face, this particular stillness that I recognized from his most serious moments in the pulpit, the expression he wore when he was preparing to carry something heavy. I told them I was gay. I told them that I had known since I was a teenager. I told them that I had prayed about it, studied it, wrestled with it honestly, and that I had come to believe that who I was didn't conflict with who God made me to be. My mother started crying immediately, not angry crying, grief crying, the particular grief of a parent who thought they knew the shape of their child's life and has just been told that the shape is different than they believed. She kept saying my name, just my name, over and over, like she was trying to hold on to it. My father said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, "I need you to leave tonight, Marcus. I need some time." Those words, "I need you to leave tonight." I have replayed them so many times that they've lost their specific sound and become just a feeling, a door closing quietly, but with the full weight of a man who means exactly what he says. I drove back to Atlanta that night with nothing resolved, and everything changed. The weeks that followed were the hardest of my life. My mother called. She cried every time, but she called. My father did not call, not for 3 weeks. The silence from him was enormous. The way silence from someone who has always been a presence is enormous. You keep expecting to hear them, and the absence is louder than noise. The church found out, as churches do, through the particular grapevine of a community where everyone has known everyone for decades. I don't know exactly how. I suspect my mother told someone she trusted, and it moved from there. Within a month of my conversation with my parents, I started getting calls from church elders, calls from women who had fed me at every church dinner. One woman called me to tell me she was praying for my deliverance, her voice full of the specific tenderness of someone who believes they are helping. An elder called to ask if I would be willing to speak with a counselor the church was affiliated with. I said no. He said he understood, and then said things that made clear he didn't. Devonte was going through a parallel version of the same thing. His mother, true to her word, had moved from grief to something more complicated but still loving, but the church was a different matter. He had told no one at New Covenant officially, but the knowledge had arrived there too, and the organ bench where he had sat for years suddenly felt like contested territory. He called me one night and said he didn't know if he could keep going in on Sundays. I told him I understood. My father called me on a Tuesday evening at the end of July, 7 weeks after the kitchen table conversation. He said, "I want you to come home this weekend. I want to talk." I drove home on a Saturday. My mother made food, the way she always does when she doesn't know how else to hold a moment. My father and I sat in his study, the same room where he had written sermons my entire childhood, where the shelves were lined with theology books and the desk was always covered in yellow legal pads. He looked tired, not angry, tired in the specific way of a man who has been doing hard interior work. He said, "I'm not going to pretend that this is something I understand yet, because I don't. I'm not going to tell you that everything is fine right now, because I'm still working through it." He paused. "But I want you to know that I am your father before I am anything else, and I am not willing to lose my son." I didn't cry in his study. I waited until I was in my car in the driveway, and then I cried so hard I couldn't see the steering wheel. It was not a full reconciliation. I want to be honest about that, because I don't want this story to have a neater resolution than the truth. My father and I entered a long, slow, difficult conversation that is still ongoing. There were things he said in those early months that hurt me. Things rooted in theology I no longer accepted, offered with love but landing like verdicts. We had arguments that left both of us exhausted and uncertain. He did not immediately change his public position. He is a pastor of a congregation to whom he has preached a specific theology for 30 years, and the reconfiguration of that theology is not a private matter for him. It involves hundreds of people and decades of commitment. I had to learn to hold space for the complexity of his position, even while insisting on the full truth of mine. My mother came around faster. Mothers often do, in my experience, not because they're morally ahead of fathers, but because their love tends to be less encumbered by the need to be theologically consistent in public. She came to Atlanta in September and took me to lunch and held my hand across the table and said, "I just want you to be happy. That's all I ever wanted." It was simple and it was real and it was enough for that moment. The church was harder. There was a Sunday in October when I drove back to Milledgeville and walked into New Covenant for the first time since coming out. I want to tell you about that moment because it was unlike anything I had anticipated. I had expected hostility. I had braced myself for cold shoulders, for the performative discomfort of people who didn't know what to do with me. Some of that happened. There were people who didn't meet my eyes, who found reasons to be elsewhere when I approached, who offered handshakes instead of the hugs they had always given me. But there were other things too. An older woman named Sister Claudette, who had been singing in the choir since before I was born, who pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than it needed to and whispered in my ear, "God made you exactly right." a teenage boy who found me after the service and said, quietly, urgently, with eyes that told me everything I needed to know about his own private struggle, "I'm glad you came back." An elder who had been one of the ones to call me with concern who, when he saw me in person, shook my hand and said nothing critical, just said, "It's good to see you, son." People are complicated. Communities are complicated. That's the thing about real life. It refuses to be sorted into the clean categories that make stories easier to tell. Devonte stopped playing organ at New Covenant in November. It wasn't a dramatic exit. He simply told my father respectfully and clearly that he needed to step away, that he couldn't continue to pour himself into a community that was still deciding whether he was acceptable. My father, to his credit, did not make it ugly. He told Devonte that the door was always open. Devonte thanked him and left. He found a church in Atlanta, an affirming congregation, and started playing there. He told me that the first Sunday he played for a church that openly celebrated who he was, he cried through the entire service. I did not go back to seminary. That decision came slowly, then all at once, the way most real decisions do. I had spent 2 years studying theology. I was increasingly unable to reconcile with the institution I had been preparing to serve. I did not stop believing in God. I want to make that clear. My faith is still real, still active, still central to who I am, but it has been stripped of the architecture that was built around it without my consent, and what's underneath is something more honest and more mine than anything I held before. I left seminary without a plan, which was terrifying for a man who had had a plan since birth. I moved fully to Atlanta, got a job, started going to an affirming church that met in a converted warehouse in East Atlanta, where the pastor was a queer black woman who preached the kind of gospel I had been starving for without knowing I was starving. I sat in a folding chair in that warehouse on my first Sunday and listened to a sermon about the God who makes space for all of it, all the complexity and the mess and the queerness and the survival, and something inside me that had been clenched for 24 years slowly began to open. I am 27 now, 3 years out from that kitchen table conversation in Milledgeville. My father and I still talk. It's still not simple. He has evolved, I can see it, slow as seasons, in the way he references my life now, in the things he doesn't say that he once would have said. He has not given an affirming sermon at New Covenant. He has not publicly changed his position. I have had to make peace with the possibility that he may not, at least not in the way I would want or in the timeline I would choose. What I hold on to is this: he did not choose the theology over his son. He is trying to hold both. That is its own kind of love, imperfect and strained and real. My mother came to Pride in Atlanta last June. She stood on Peachtree Street in the heat, wearing a t-shirt I had not asked her to buy, and cried when the marchers came by. I put my arm around her and she leaned into me, and we just stood there together in the middle of all of it. And I thought about that baptism when I was 9 years old, the white robe and the burgundy Bible and my father's tears from the pulpit, and I thought about how the same love that filled that moment was filling this one too. Changed, complicated, continuing. Devonte and I are still close, still the kind of friends who can go months without talking and then pick up in the middle of a sentence. He is in a relationship now with a man who treats him with the kind of tenderness he deserved his entire life. I had dinner with them last fall and watched him laugh across the table and thought this is what all those years of survival were building toward, not just endurance. This. I still have the burgundy Bible. It sits on my nightstand in my apartment in Atlanta. I still read it, which surprises some people when I tell them, people who assume that coming out of a conservative religious background means coming out of faith entirely. But my faith was never the problem. It was what was built around it. The scaffolding was the problem, not the foundation. I have been slowly, carefully learning to tell the difference. There are nights when I sit with that Bible in my lap, and I think about that 9-year-old boy in the white robe standing at the edge of the baptismal pool. I think about the man his father believed he was, the man the church expected him to become, the man he was so terrified of not being. And then I think about who I actually am, imperfect and still figuring it out, carrying grief and gratitude in equal measure, gay and faithful and free in ways I am still learning how to fully inhabit. I think that boy would be okay with who I turned out to be. I think, if I am honest, he always knew this was where we were going. He just needed 24 years and a long, hard road and a quiet living room in Milledgeville and the courage to say it out loud. I was Pastor Raymond Tate's son, and I am still his son, and I am also fully and completely and irrevocably myself. And the God I believe in, the one I found underneath all that scaffolding, the one who was there before the sermons and the expectations and the gold-lettered Bible, I believe that God has been here for all of it, not fixing me, just walking with me. That's the story I would preach if I ever stood in a pulpit again. And some days, in that warehouse church in East Atlanta on a folding chair with the music filling the converted walls, I think maybe I already am.